Get out. The crystal glass shattered against the mahogany door frame, missing the retreating doctor by inches. Dr. Lysander Cross ducked, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest as he scrambled toward the mansion's entrance hall. Evangeline Sterling stood frozen on the doorstep, her nursing credentials still clutched in her hand, watching the distinguished physician flee past her like a man escaping a crime scene. Through the open doorway, she could hear ragged breathing and what sounded like furniture being overturned. "You must be the new nurse." Dr. Cross paused at his Mercedes, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. "I should warn you, Mr. Blackwater is particularly volatile today. He threw his heart medication in the fireplace an hour ago." Evangeline felt her stomach drop. She'd driven 4 hours from Boston for this position, leaving behind her stable job at Massachusetts General specifically because the salary offered was triple her current income. The mysterious phone call had been brief: a wealthy patient requiring private cardiac care, complete confidentiality required, live-in position at an estate in Crescent Ridge. "What exactly is his condition?" she asked, but Dr. Cross was already reversing down the circular driveway. Another crash echoed from inside the mansion. Evangeline grabbed her suitcase and medical bag, steeling herself as she crossed the threshold. The interior was magnificent: soaring ceilings, imported marble, artwork that belonged in museums. But the elegance was marred by scattered papers and an overturned chair near the grand staircase. "Mr. Blackwater?" Her voice carried through the silence that followed the chaos. "I said get out." The voice came from behind heavy oak doors to her left. It was deep, roughened by what sounded like exhaustion and fury in equal measure. Evangeline approached the doors, noting the medical equipment visible through the gap: a portable EKG machine, oxygen tanks, various monitors that should have been connected to a patient but sat unused. She pushed the door open. Thaddeus Blackwater stood with his back to her, gripping the mantle of an enormous fireplace. Even from behind, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing seemed labored. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it. Scattered around the room were pill bottles, their contents spilled across Persian rugs. "You have about 30 seconds to leave before I call security," he said without turning around. "Your heart rate is elevated," Evangeline observed, noting the visible pulse in his neck, the slight tremor in his hands. "When did you last take your medication?" That made him turn. Thaddeus Blackwater was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp green eyes that held a combination of pain and rage that made her chest tighten. There were dark circles under those eyes, and his complexion had a grayish pallor that she recognized from countless cardiac patients. "I don't need another nurse telling me how to die," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Good thing I'm here to help you live." Something flickered across his face: surprise, maybe, or annoyance that she hadn't fled like Dr. Cross. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her practical navy scrubs, the way she stood her ground despite his obvious hostility. "The agency didn't tell you, did they?" A bitter smile curved his lips. "I'm not getting better. This isn't about recovery or rehabilitation or any of the hopeful nonsense they usually peddle. I'm dying, Miss Sterling. Evangeline Sterling." She set down her bags, her eyes scanning the discarded medical equipment. "And according to your file, you're suffering from cardiomyopathy that requires surgical intervention. Treatable condition. Treatable if I wanted treatment." He moved away from the fireplace, and she noticed the slight favor he gave his left side, the way his breathing remained shallow. "Which I don't." Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. She'd worked with terminal patients before, had helped families navigate end-of-life care, but this felt different. Thaddeus Blackwater wasn't dying from his condition. He was choosing to die from it. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. His green eyes went cold. "That's not your concern, Miss Sterling. Your job, if you choose to stay, is to keep me comfortable until the inevitable happens. Nothing more." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 5 o'clock, the sound echoing through the tension-filled room. Evangeline looked at the scattered medications, the unused equipment, the man who was essentially committing an elaborate form of suicide, and made a decision that would change everything. "I'll stay," she said quietly, "but I won't help you die." The first 48 hours felt like a war of attrition. Thaddeus refused every attempt at basic cardiac monitoring. dismissed the meal plans Evangeline prepared specifically for his condition, and had taken to locking himself in his study whenever she approached with anything resembling medical equipment. Evangeline found herself essentially acting as a highly overqualified housekeeper in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum. The staff was minimal: a groundskeeper who came twice weekly, a housekeeper who avoided the main living areas when Thaddeus was present, and a cook who left prepared meals that largely went untouched. On the third morning, she discovered him collapsed at the bottom of the main staircase. He was conscious but disoriented, his skin clammy and pale. Evangeline knelt beside him, automatically checking his pulse, rapid and irregular, exactly what she'd feared. "Don't," he said weakly when she reached for her medical bag. "Just leave me here." "Not happening." She was already pulling out her portable blood pressure cuff. "You can fire me afterward, but right now you need immediate attention." For once, he was too weak to fight her. His blood pressure was dangerously elevated, and she could hear the irregular rhythm in his heartbeat that spoke of serious arrhythmia. As she worked, something nagged at the back of her mind, a sense of familiarity that went beyond their recent acquaintance. "When did you last see a cardiologist?" she asked, helping him sit upright against the staircase banister. "6 months ago." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Before I decided to stop pretending there was a point." Evangeline paused in adjusting the blood pressure cuff. 6 months ago. Something about the time frame, combined with his face in this vulnerable state, triggered a memory she couldn't quite grasp. A late shift at Massachusetts General, a trauma case that had gone wrong, a family member who'd arrived too late. "What's your sister's name?" The question came out before she could stop herself. Thaddeus went rigid. The color that had been slowly returning to his face drained away completely, and his eyes sharpened with a focus that was almost frightening. "Get away from me," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Now." He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly, but managing to stand. "Whatever sick game you're playing, whatever you think you know about my family, I want you out of this house in the next 10 minutes. Evangeline felt the memory crystallizing, becoming clearer. Massachusetts General, the cardiac wing, a young woman who'd been brought in from a car accident, but whose blood work had shown inconsistencies that never made it into the official report. A brother who'd arrived at the hospital wild with grief and guilt, convinced he was responsible for her death. The same green eyes, the same sharp jawline, the same voice, though it had been broken with anguish then rather than hardened with rage. "Isadora," she said softly. Thaddeus stopped moving entirely. For a moment, the only sound in the vast entry hall was the ticking of the grandfather clock and his labored breathing. "How do you know that name?" His words came out like splinters of ice. Evangeline's mind raced. She remembered now, remembered the night shift 5 years ago when Isadora Blackwater had been brought in from a single-car accident on Route 2. Remembered the unusual toxicology results that had been flagged but somehow disappeared from the final reports. Remembered the brother who'd blamed himself, who'd been convinced that an argument they'd had earlier that evening had caused her to drive recklessly. But she also remembered details that had never sat right with her. Blood work that showed substances that weren't consistent with recreational drug use. A body temperature that had been too low for the circumstances. Signs that had pointed to something more sinister than a tragic accident. "I was her nurse," Evangeline said quietly. "That night at Mass General. I remember you." Thaddeus stared at her for what felt like an eternity. She could see him processing this information, could almost watch the walls he'd built around himself growing higher and more impenetrable. "Then you know," he said finally. "You know what I did to her." The guilt in his voice was so raw it made her chest ache. This was why he was refusing treatment, why he'd isolated himself in this mansion to die. He believed he was responsible for his sister's death, and he'd decided that his own life was the price he owed. But Evangeline remembered other details too. Details that might change everything he believed about that night. "Mr. Blackwater," she said carefully, "what exactly do you remember about the evening Isadora died?" His laugh was bitter and broken. "Everything. Every word of our fight. Every cruel thing I said that made her storm out of here and get in that car. Every second I waited before going after her." He turned toward the staircase, gripping the banister like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "By the time I reached the hospital, she was already gone." Evangeline watched him climb the stairs, each step seeming to cost him tremendous effort. The irregular heartbeat was getting worse. She could see it in the way he paused every few steps, in the tremor in his hands. As he disappeared into the upper floors of the mansion, she remained in the entry hall, her mind spinning with implications. She'd kept copies of those toxicology reports, had been troubled enough by the inconsistencies to save them to her personal files. Reports that showed Isadora Blackwater hadn't died from injuries sustained in a car accident. She'd died from poisoning. Evangeline spent the next morning exploring the mansion while Thaddeus remained barricaded in his study. The silence from behind those heavy oak doors was more unsettling than his earlier outbursts. She'd slipped his heart medication under the door along with breakfast, but both remained untouched when she checked an hour later. The mansion revealed its secrets slowly. In the East Wing library, she found the first photograph of Isadora Blackwater tucked between the pages of a medical journal. The young woman was stunning, with the same green eyes as her brother, but softer, warmer. She was laughing at something off-camera, her arm linked with Thaddeus's at what appeared to be some kind of formal event. More photos emerged as Evangeline continued her search. Isadora at a charity gala, Isadora cutting the ribbon at what looked like a hospital opening, Isadora in a lab coat standing beside medical equipment. The images painted a picture of someone deeply involved in healthcare, someone who cared about making a difference. The memory that had been nagging at Evangeline suddenly snapped into sharp focus. Isadora hadn't just been a victim that night at Mass General. She'd been a research scientist working on cardiac medications, someone whose work had been making headlines in medical journals. The toxicology report that had troubled Evangeline so much showed traces of compounds that weren't recreational drugs. They were experimental cardiac medications that Isadora herself had been developing. Someone had used her own research to kill her. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted her thoughts. Through the library's tall windows, she watched an elegant silver Porsche pull up to the mansion's entrance. The woman who emerged was striking, platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, designer clothing that probably cost more than Evangeline's annual salary, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. Evangeline made her way to the front entrance just as the woman raised her hand to knock. "You must be the new nurse," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that had been carefully refined. "I'm Vivian Harrington, an old friend of the family. I've been so worried about Thaddeus since he stopped taking visitors." There was something about Vivian's smile that didn't reach her eyes, something predatory in the way she assessed Evangeline from head to toe. The kind of look that sized up competition and found it lacking. "Mr. Blackwater isn't receiving visitors today," Evangeline replied carefully. "His condition requires rest." "Oh, I'm hardly a visitor," Vivian laughed, stepping past Evangeline into the foyer as if she owned the place. "Thaddeus and I have known each other since childhood. My family's estate is just over the hill. I was devastated when I heard about his diagnosis." Evangeline felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the way Vivian spoke about Thaddeus's condition felt wrong. Too familiar, too detailed for someone who claimed to be just an old friend. "How exactly did you hear about his diagnosis?" Evangeline asked. "Mr. Blackwater seems very private about his medical situation." Vivian's smile faltered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Dr. Cross is an old family friend as well. He mentioned how concerned he was when Thaddeus started refusing treatment. Such a tragedy, really. First Isadora, now this." The casual mention of Isadora's name made Evangeline's pulse quicken. She watched Vivian's face carefully as she continued. "You knew Isadora well?" "We were like sisters," Vivian said, but something flickered in her expression. "Her death absolutely destroyed Thaddeus. He's never been the same since that terrible accident. The guilt has been eating away at him for years." That was interesting. Vivian was pushing the narrative that Isadora's death was an accident caused by guilt, the same story Thaddeus believed. But Evangeline knew better. The toxicology reports proved otherwise. "What exactly happened that night?" Evangeline asked, keeping her voice neutral. Vivian moved deeper into the mansion, her eyes scanning the scattered medical equipment, the overturned furniture that hadn't been cleaned up from Thaddeus's earlier outbursts. She seemed to be cataloging everything, making mental notes. "Thaddeus and Isadora had a terrible fight about her work," Vivian said, picking up a crystal paperweight from a side table and examining it. "She was always so reckless with those experimental drugs she was developing. Thaddeus was trying to convince her to be more careful, and she stormed out angry. got in her car, and drove straight into a tree on Route 2. The story was plausible enough, but there were holes that bothered Evangeline. If Isadora was a careful scientist, why would she have been reckless with experimental compounds? And why would traces of her own cardiac medications show up in lethal concentrations in her bloodstream? Where were you that night? The question slipped out before Evangeline could stop herself. Vivian's hand stilled on the paperweight. For a split second, her carefully composed mask slipped, and Evangeline saw something cold and calculating underneath. I was at a charity function in Boston, Vivian said smoothly. The Children's Hospital Gala. There are hundreds of witnesses and photographs if you're curious about my whereabouts. But alibis could be manufactured, and charity galas were notorious for being easy to slip away from unnoticed. Evangeline filed the information away for later consideration. A sound from upstairs made both women look toward the grand staircase. Thaddeus appeared at the top of the steps, gripping the banister heavily. His condition had deteriorated noticeably since their confrontation the day before. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and she could see the effort it cost him just to remain standing. "Vivian," he said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "What are you doing here?" "Checking on you, darling." Vivian's voice took on a syrupy quality that made Evangeline's skin crawl. "Dr. Cross told me you've been refusing treatment again. You know that's not what Isadora would have wanted." The mention of his sister's name made Thaddeus flinch visibly. Evangeline watched the interaction with growing unease, noting how Vivian seemed to know exactly which emotional buttons to push, how she used Isadora's memory as a weapon. "Isadora is dead because of me," Thaddeus said quietly. "Her wants don't matter anymore." Vivian's eyes lit up with what looked like satisfaction, though she quickly masked it with concern. "You can't keep blaming yourself forever, Thaddeus. Accidents happen." But as Evangeline studied Vivian's face, she was becoming increasingly certain that Isadora Blackwater's death had been no accident at all. After Vivian left with promises to check on Thaddeus again soon, the mansion fell into an oppressive silence. Evangeline found Thaddeus in the library, slumped in a leather armchair that dwarfed his increasingly frail frame. The confrontation with Vivian had clearly exhausted him, and she could see the irregular rise and fall of his chest that indicated his heart was struggling. "You should eat something," she said quietly, setting a tray of soup and medication on the table beside him. "Not hungry." His voice was barely above a whisper, but his eyes tracked her movements with an alertness that contradicted his physical weakness. "Your body needs fuel to fight this condition, especially if you're not taking your heart medication consistently." "I told you, I'm not fighting anything anymore." He shifted in the chair, wincing slightly. "The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us." Evangeline studied his profile, noting the sharp cheekbones that had become more pronounced over the past few days, the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. But there was something else she noticed too. A flicker of curiosity when he thought she wasn't looking, a spark that suggested the man who had built a technology empire wasn't entirely ready to surrender. "What did Vivian mean about Isadora's work being reckless?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. Isadora was developing experimental cardiac medications, breakthrough treatments that could have revolutionized how we treat heart disease. But the clinical trials were aggressive, and some of the compounds were potentially dangerous if misused. "And you argued about that the night she died?" "I told her she was pushing too hard, too fast, that she needed to slow down and consider the risks." His hands clenched into fists. "She said I didn't understand her work, that I was trying to control her like everyone else in her life." She was right. Evangeline felt pieces of a puzzle shifting in her mind. If Isadora was working with experimental cardiac medications, and those same compounds had shown up in her toxicology report, it painted a very different picture than the accident everyone believed had occurred. "Mr. Blackwater, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." He looked at her with those sharp green eyes, and she saw a wariness there that spoke of too many people who had tried to manipulate him over the years. "Did Isadora ever mention feeling threatened by anyone? Anyone who might have wanted to stop her research?" "What kind of question is that?" His voice hardened. "Isadora died in a car accident because she was upset and driving recklessly. End of story." But Evangeline could see doubt flickering behind his anger, the same doubt that had been nagging at her since she'd remembered the inconsistencies in Isadora's case. I need to make a phone call, she said, standing abruptly. There's something I need to verify. Thaddeus watched her leave the library with an expression she couldn't read. Evangeline made her way to the small guest room that had become her temporary quarters and pulled out her laptop. Her hands were shaking slightly as she logged into the Massachusetts General Portal, using the access credentials that hadn't been deactivated when she'd taken her leave of absence. The Blackwater file was still there, buried in the trauma cases from 5 years ago. Evangeline's throat tightened as she opened Isadora's records, seeing again the beautiful young woman who had been brought in too late for anyone to save. But the toxicology report told a story that had never made it into the official investigation. Isadora's blood had contained therapeutic levels of 3 different experimental cardiac medications that were still in clinical trials. Individually, each medication was potentially life-saving. Together, in the combinations found in her system, they created a lethal cardiac arrhythmia that would have been virtually undetectable without specific testing. Someone with intimate knowledge of Isadora's research had used her own work to murder her. Someone who knew exactly which compounds would create a fatal interaction and how to make it look like an accidental overdose of experimental drugs. Evangeline's stomach churned as she read through the rest of the file. The emergency room notes indicated that Isadora had been conscious when the paramedics found her at the accident scene. She'd been trying to say something, but the words were unintelligible due to the effects of the cardiac medications. She'd died en route to the hospital, her heart simply stopping from the toxic combination in her bloodstream. The car accident hadn't killed Isadora Blackwater. It had just provided convenient cover for murder, and Thaddeus had spent 5 years believing he was responsible for her death. Evangeline stared at the screen, her mind racing through the implications. If she told Thaddeus the truth, it would shatter everything he believed about that night. But it might also give him a reason to fight for his life again, to stop this slow suicide he was committing in penance for a crime he hadn't committed. On the other hand, it would also mean revealing that someone close to Isadora had betrayed and killed her. Someone who might still be in Thaddeus's life, still posing a threat. Someone like Vivian Harrington, who had conveniently been at a charity gala in Boston the night of the murder, who knew intimate details about Isadora's research and Thaddeus's medical condition, who seemed far too interested in maintaining the narrative that Isadora's death was an accident caused by Thaddeus's guilt. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Evangeline quickly closed the laptop and opened the door to find Thaddeus standing in the hallway, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His color had improved slightly, and she realized he must have finally taken some of his medication. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. Evangeline studied his face, seeing an intelligence there that had been dimmed by grief and guilt, but was still sharp enough to read between the lines. This man had built a fortune by recognizing patterns and making connections that others missed. He'd noticed her reaction to his story about Isadora, had picked up on the implications of her questions. "Mr. Blackwater." "Thaddeus," he corrected quietly. "If you're about to tell me something that's going to change everything I believe about my sister's death, I think we're past formalities." Evangeline felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Once she spoke, there would be no taking it back. The truth would be out there, along with all its dangerous implications. "The night Isadora died," she said carefully, there were inconsistencies in her medical records, things that didn't add up. Thaddeus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The space suddenly felt much smaller with his presence filling it. What kind of inconsistencies? The toxicology report showed compounds in her bloodstream that weren't consistent with recreational drug use or accidental overdose. They were specific combinations of the cardiac medications she was researching, combinations that would only be lethal if someone knew exactly how they would interact. She watched the color drain from his face as the implications sank in. "Are you telling me?" He started, then stopped, his hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "I'm telling you that your sister didn't die because of anything you said or did that night. She died because someone who knew her work intimately used it to kill her." The silence that followed was deafening. Evangeline could hear her own heartbeat, could see the rapid pulse in Thaddeus's neck as he processed this information. When he finally looked at her again, the grief in his eyes had been replaced by something much more dangerous. "Who?" The single word came out like a blade. "I don't know yet," Evangeline admitted. but I intend to find out. Thaddeus moved to the window, staring out at the grounds of his estate where the autumn leaves were beginning to fall. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. If what you're saying is true, then I've been hiding here feeling sorry for myself while my sister's killer walks free. Thaddeus, we need to be careful about this. Whoever killed Isadora is still out there, and they obviously have access to your life, your medical information. The fact that you're refusing treatment plays right into their hands. He turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the mansion, she saw the man who had built an empire. The grief and guilt were still there, but they were overlaid now with a razor-sharp focus that was both impressive and slightly terrifying. Then it's time to stop playing dead, he said quietly, and start hunting. The transformation in Thaddeus over the next 3 days was remarkable. Knowing that Isadora's death wasn't his fault had lifted a weight from his shoulders that Evangeline could actually see in his posture, in the way he moved through the mansion with renewed purpose. He'd started taking his heart medication regularly, had begun eating the meals she prepared, and most importantly, he'd agreed to let her run basic cardiac monitoring. But with clarity came anger, and Thaddeus's rage was a controlled, methodical thing that was somehow more unsettling than his previous despair. I've been thinking about that night, he said, joining her in the library where she'd been researching cardiac drug interactions on her laptop. About who had access to Isadora's research, who would have known enough about her work to weaponize it. Evangeline looked up from her screen, noting that his color was much better today. The regular medication was working, bringing his heart rhythm back toward normal ranges. But there was an intensity in his green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent planning. Dr. Cross was consulting on her research. Thaddeus continued, settling into the chair across from her. He was one of the few people outside her lab team who had complete access to her compound formulations. The same Dr. Cross who's been treating your current condition? The same one who's been mysteriously unavailable since you arrived, despite claiming my case was critical. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. The same one who seemed terrified when he ran out of here the day you started. Evangeline felt puzzle pieces clicking into place. Dr. Cross's strange behavior, his reluctance to stay and monitor Thaddeus's condition, the way he'd fled when confronted with any resistance to his treatment protocols. There's something else, she said carefully. I've been monitoring your heart medication, and some of the dosages don't match what's on the labels. Thaddeus went very still. What do you mean? The antidepressants Dr. Cross prescribed for your grief, they're not what they claim to be. The pills have been altered somehow, combined with sedatives that would keep you in a state of lethargy and despair. Someone's been deliberately keeping you medicated into submission. The silence that followed was explosive in its intensity. Evangeline watched Thaddeus process this information, saw the moment when he realized he'd been systematically poisoned just like his sister. How long? His voice was deadly quiet. Based on your symptoms when I arrived, probably months. Maybe since your diagnosis was first confirmed. Thaddeus stood abruptly, pacing to the window with an energy she hadn't seen since her arrival. The weak, dying man who'd thrown crystal glasses at doctors was gone, replaced by someone who radiated the kind of focused determination that had built a technology empire from nothing. Vivian knew about my diagnosis before I told anyone, he said, turning back to face her. She mentioned details about my condition that only Dr. Cross should have known. She also knew an awful lot about Isadora's work for someone who claimed to be just a family friend. Vivian was never just anything. Thaddeus's expression darkened. Her family's pharmaceutical company was one of Isadora's potential investors. She'd been pushing for exclusive rights to develop Isadora's cardiac compounds for commercial use. Evangeline felt her pulse quicken. And if Isadora was killed before those deals were finalized, the research would become part of her estate, which means it would have come to me. Thaddeus's eyes widened as he worked through the implications. And if something happened to me before I could understand its value, the rights would go to whoever was positioned to claim them. Someone who'd spent years cultivating access to your family, your medical team, your trust. They stared at each other across the library, the full scope of the conspiracy becoming clear. Vivian hadn't just killed Isadora for personal reasons. She'd orchestrated an elaborate plan to steal revolutionary medical research worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She's been playing a long game, Evangeline said quietly. Kill Isadora, make it look like an accident, then slowly poison you into despair and death while positioning herself as the grieving family friend who inherits everything. Thaddeus moved closer to where she sat, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could smell the subtle cologne that clung to his skin. The proximity made her pulse flutter in a way that had nothing to do with the danger they were discussing. "If you hadn't come here," he said softly, "if you hadn't remembered that night at the hospital, she would have succeeded." There was something in his voice, in the way he was looking at her, that made the air between them feel charged with possibility. Evangeline had spent her career maintaining professional boundaries, keeping emotional distance from her patients. But Thaddeus wasn't really her patient anymore. He was something much more complicated. "We still need proof," she said, trying to ignore the way her breathing had become shallow. "Everything we have is circumstantial. Then we get proof." He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the arm of her chair. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. "But Evangeline, I need you to know what you've done for me, what you've given me back. I'll never be able to repay that." The intensity in his gaze made her chest tight. This wasn't just gratitude she was seeing. It was something deeper, more dangerous. Something that could complicate everything they were trying to accomplish. "Thaddeus," she started, but was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. They both turned toward the window to see Dr. Cross's Mercedes pulling up to the mansion's entrance. But this time, he wasn't alone. Vivian's silver Porsche was right behind him, and both cars had an urgency to their arrival that set off alarm bells in Evangeline's mind. "They know," Thaddeus said quietly. "Somehow, they know we're onto them." Evangeline felt her training kick in, the same calm focus that had helped her handle medical emergencies. "We need to record whatever they say, get them to admit something we can use." Thaddeus pulled out his phone, setting it to record before slipping it into his shirt pocket. "Follow my lead, and whatever happens, don't let them know we suspect anything." The front door opened without a knock, and they could hear Vivian's voice carrying through the mansion's halls, sharp with barely controlled panic. "Thaddeus, we need to talk. Now." Evangeline and Thaddeus exchanged a look loaded with unspoken communication. The next few minutes would determine whether they lived to expose the truth, or whether Vivian's long game would finally reach its deadly conclusion. "Showtime," Thaddeus murmured, and despite everything, Evangeline felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement rather than fear. They were about to go up against a killer who'd spent years perfecting her plan. But for the first time since arriving at the mansion, Evangeline felt like they might actually have a chance of winning. As they walked toward the foyer to face their enemies, she was acutely aware of Thaddeus beside her, of the way his presence made her feel stronger and more vulnerable at the same time. Whatever happened next, whatever truth they uncovered, she knew her life had been irrevocably changed by this man and his quest for justice. The real question was whether they would both survive long enough to see where that change might lead. Vivian burst into the foyer with Dr. Cross trailing behind her, both of them radiating an energy that immediately put Evangeline on edge. Vivian's usual composed elegance was frayed around the edges. Her perfectly styled hair showed signs of hasty finger-combing, and there was a manic brightness in her eyes that spoke of desperation barely held in check. "Thaddeus, thank God you're all right," she said, rushing toward him with outstretched arms. "When Dr. Cross told me what he'd discovered, I had to come immediately." Thaddeus stepped back slightly, avoiding her embrace in a way that made Vivian's expression flicker with annoyance before she masked it with concern. "What did he discover?" Thaddeus asked, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Cross cleared his throat nervously, his hands fidgeting with his medical bag. "I've been doing some research into Miss Sterling's background, given the concerning changes in your condition since her arrival." Evangeline felt ice forming in her stomach. She'd been so focused on uncovering the truth about Isadora that she hadn't considered how her own past might be weaponized against her. "What kind of research?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Vivian's smile was sharp as a blade. "The kind that reveals you were working at Massachusetts General the night Isadora died. The kind that shows you were assigned to the cardiac unit when she was brought in." The words hit the foyer like a physical force. Evangeline felt Thaddeus go rigid beside her, felt the temperature in the room drop by degrees as he turned to stare at her with an expression of dawning betrayal. "Is that true?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Evangeline's mouth went dry. She'd planned to tell him about her connection to Isadora's case when the time was right, when she had more evidence to support her theories about the murder. But having it revealed like this, twisted and stripped of context, made her look like she'd been manipulating him from the beginning. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was there that night." Dr. Cross stepped forward, his confidence growing as he sensed weakness. "What Miss Sterling hasn't told you is that she was reprimanded for irregularities in her patient care that evening. There were questions about her handling of critical toxicology results, questions about whether proper protocols were followed." "That's not what happened," Evangeline protested, but she could see from Thaddeus's expression that the damage was already done. Vivian moved closer to Thaddeus, her hand coming to rest on his arm in a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive. "She targeted you specifically, Thaddeus. Don't you see? She sought out this position because she knew about your connection to Isadora's case. She's been playing some sick game with your grief." "No," Evangeline said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I came here because I needed the job, because the salary was good. I didn't even recognize you until after I arrived." But even as she said it, she could see how hollow it sounded. How convenient it seemed that the nurse who'd been present at Isadora's death had randomly ended up caring for her brother 5 years later. Thaddeus was staring at her with those sharp green eyes, and she could see him working through the implications, could see the trust they'd been building crumbling in real time. "You knew," he said, his voice flat with betrayal. "When you asked me about Isadora's name, when you pushed me to talk about that night, you already knew who I was. I recognized you. Yes, but you didn't think it was important to mention that you were there when my sister died?" The pain in his voice was like a physical blow. "That you were responsible for her care?" Dr. Cross seized on the opening. The irregularities in Miss Sterling's handling of the case were significant enough that she was quietly transferred to a different department. There were questions about whether she'd been under the influence that night, whether she'd properly processed the toxicology results that might have saved Isadora's life. The lie was so smoothly delivered, so perfectly crafted to destroy her credibility, that Evangeline felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She'd never been reprimanded, had never been under the influence, but proving that now would be impossible. Personnel records could be altered, witnesses could be bought, and the truth could be buried under layers of carefully constructed deception. "You let me blame myself," Thaddeus said quietly, and the betrayal in his voice cut deeper than any accusation. "You sat there and listened to me tear myself apart with guilt, and you knew the whole time that you were the one who failed her." "That's not what happened," Evangeline said desperately. "Thaddeus, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you've been manipulating me from the moment you walked through that door. How you've been using my sister's death to get close to me." Vivian's hand tightened on Thaddeus's arm, and Evangeline saw satisfaction flash across her face before she masked it with concern. "She's been playing with your emotions, darling. Using your grief and guilt to make you dependent on her." "The medication changes," Dr. Cross added, his voice gaining confidence. "Miss Sterling has been altering your prescriptions without my authorization. The improvements you've been experiencing aren't from proper medical care. They're from her manipulating your treatment to create the illusion that she's helping you." Evangeline felt the walls closing in around her. Every truth was being twisted, every good intention reframed as manipulation. The evidence she'd gathered about Isadora's murder would sound like desperate deflection now, like a guilty woman trying to shift blame onto innocent people. "I need you to leave," Thaddeus said, his voice hollow. "I need you out of my house and out of my life." "Thaddeus, please," she tried one more time. "If you'll just listen to me. If you'll let me show you what I found about Isadora's toxicology reports. Enough." The shout echoed through the foyer, and she could see that his cardiac condition was being aggravated by the stress. His breathing was becoming labored, his color shifting toward gray. "I don't want to hear any more of your lies. I don't want to see your face again." Vivian stepped closer to him, her arm sliding around his waist in a gesture of support. "You need to calm down, darling. Your heart can't take this kind of stress." But Evangeline could see what Vivian was really doing, positioning herself as the supportive presence while eliminating the threat that Evangeline represented. The killer was winning, was successfully isolating her victim and removing the one person who could expose the truth. "Pack your things," Thaddeus said, not looking at her anymore. "I want you gone within the hour." Dr. Cross moved to Thaddeus's side, pulling out a syringe from his medical bag. Let me give you something to help with the anxiety. This stress isn't good for your condition. Evangeline wanted to scream, wanted to grab the syringe and demand to know what was really in it. But she'd lost all credibility, all trust. Anything she said now would only make things worse. Fine, she said quietly, her voice barely steady. I'll go. As she turned toward the stairs, she caught sight of Vivian's reflection in the hallway mirror. For just a moment, when she thought no one was looking, the mask of concern slipped completely. The expression underneath was cold, triumphant, and utterly without remorse. Evangeline climbed the stairs to pack her things, her mind racing even as her heart shattered. She'd failed Thaddeus, failed Isadora, failed to expose the truth before Vivian could complete her deadly game. But as she threw her belongings into her suitcase, she could hear voices from downstairs, Dr. Cross administering medication, Vivian's soothing tones as she helped Thaddeus to his study. The same study where he'd been isolating himself before Evangeline's arrival, where he'd been slowly dying under the care of people who wanted him dead. She was leaving him in the hands of his sister's killer, leaving him to the same fate that had claimed Isadora. The thought made her physically sick, but she was out of options. Thaddeus would never trust her again, would never believe anything she said about Vivian or Dr. Cross. As she carried her suitcase down the stairs, she saw them through the open door of the study. Vivian sitting close beside Thaddeus on the couch, her hand stroking his hair as Dr. Cross monitored his vital signs. The picture of concerned friends helping a troubled man through a difficult time. Except Evangeline could see the satisfaction in Vivian's posture, could see the way Dr. Cross's hands shook slightly as he prepared another injection. They were already moving to the next phase of their plan, already working to undo the progress Thaddeus had made since learning the truth about his medication. Goodbye, Thaddeus, she said quietly from the doorway. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence. Vivian did, though, meeting Evangeline's eyes with a smile that was pure poison. Drive safely, dear, Vivian said sweetly. The roads can be so dangerous at night. The threat was subtle but clear. Evangeline was being warned to stay away, to keep quiet about what she suspected. The same way Isadora had probably been warned before her final, fatal drive. As Evangeline walked out of the mansion and into the crisp October evening, she felt the weight of failure crushing down on her. She'd saved countless patients in her career, had prided herself on being able to make a difference when it mattered most. But this time, when it mattered more than it ever had before, she'd lost everything. Evangeline didn't drive far. Instead of heading back to Boston as everyone expected, she pulled into a rest area about 2 miles from the mansion and sat in her car, staring at her phone. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to find some way to protect Thaddeus from what she knew was coming. But what could she do? He'd made it clear he never wanted to see her again. She was still sitting there an hour later when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Miss Sterling. The voice was shaky, filled with panic. This is Dr. Cross. You need to come back immediately. Thaddeus there's been a complication. Evangeline's heart stopped. What kind of complication? Severe cardiac arrhythmia. He collapsed about 20 minutes after you left. I'm trying to stabilize him, but... Dr. Cross's voice broke. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending. What are you talking about? The medications. Miss Harrington, she made me alter them. She has evidence of a mistake I made years ago, a patient who died because of my negligence. She's been blackmailing me to keep Thaddeus sedated, to make his condition worse. Evangeline was already turning her car around, pressing the accelerator harder than was safe on the winding country roads. How long has this been going on? Months. Since his initial diagnosis. She wanted him weak, dependent, ready to give up. But when you came, when he started improving, she panicked. The injection I gave him tonight, it wasn't for anxiety. It was designed to trigger a massive cardiac event. The admission hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Vivian wasn't just planning Thaddeus's death. She was actively causing it, using his own doctor as an unwilling accomplice. Where is she now? She sent me away. Said she wanted to be alone with him in his final moments. But Miss Sterling, I think she's going to make sure he doesn't survive this attack. Evangeline pressed harder on the accelerator, her nursing training warring with terror for Thaddeus's life. If Vivian was alone with him during a cardiac crisis, she could easily ensure that help arrived too late, that any resuscitation attempts failed. Call 911. She ordered Dr. Cross. Tell them you have a patient in cardiac arrest at the Blackwater estate. I'm 5 minutes out. Miss Sterling, there's something else you need to know. About that night 5 years ago, about Isadora. Tell me. Miss Harrington was there. At the hospital. She followed the ambulance from the accident scene. Claimed to be family, so she could get information about Isadora's condition. She asked detailed questions about the toxicology results, about what treatments we were attempting. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Vivian had followed her victim to the hospital to make sure the poisoning would be written off as an accident, to ensure that no one looked too closely at the evidence. She killed her, Evangeline said, stating the obvious. I suspected, but I could never prove it. And when she came to me with evidence of my malpractice, when she threatened to destroy my career, Dr. Cross's voice was thick with shame. I convinced myself I was just helping with medication management. I told myself Thaddeus was going to die anyway. Evangeline skidded into the mansion's driveway to find it eerily quiet. No ambulance yet, no signs of emergency response. Through the windows, she could see soft lighting in what looked like the study, but no movement. She grabbed her medical bag and ran for the front door, finding it unlocked. The silence inside the mansion was deafening. No sounds of medical emergency, no voices calling for help. Just an oppressive quiet that made her skin crawl. Thaddeus, she called out, moving quickly toward the study. She found him on the couch, unconscious and barely breathing. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of severe cardiac distress, and she could see the irregular pulse in his neck that indicated dangerous arrhythmia. But there was no sign of Vivian. Evangeline immediately went to work, checking his vital signs and pulling emergency cardiac medication from her bag. His pulse was erratic and weak, his blood pressure dangerously low. Without immediate intervention, he would be dead within minutes. I wondered when you'd show up. Evangeline spun around to find Vivian standing in the doorway, no longer bothering to hide the cold calculation in her expression. Gone was any pretense of grief or concern. What stood before her was a predator who'd been interrupted while finishing her kill. Step away from him, Vivian said quietly. Let nature take its course. He's dying, Evangeline said, continuing to work on stabilizing Thaddeus's heart rhythm. We need to get him to a hospital immediately. No, we don't. Vivian moved closer, and Evangeline noticed she was holding something in her hand, a syringe filled with clear liquid. Thaddeus is finally going to join his beloved sister. Isn't that what he's wanted all along? You killed her. It wasn't a question. Vivian's smile was sharp and satisfied. Isadora thought she was so brilliant, so important with her revolutionary cardiac research. She had no idea that her own compounds could be turned against her so easily. Why? Evangeline kept working on Thaddeus, monitoring his pulse while trying to keep Vivian talking. The longer she could delay whatever was in that syringe, the better chance the ambulance had of arriving in time. Because she was in my way, Vivian said, as if it were obvious. Her research was worth hundreds of millions, and she was too idealistic to properly monetize it. She wanted to give it away to universities, to make it freely available to help people. Such a waste. So you poisoned her. I gave her a taste of her own medicine, literally. A careful combination of her own cardiac compounds that would stop her heart within hours of ingestion. The beauty of it was that it looked like she'd been experimenting on herself, a brilliant scientist who got too reckless with her own research. Evangeline felt sick at the casual way Vivian described murdering a woman who'd been trying to save lives. And the car accident. Pure luck. I'd expected her to collapse at home, for the poisoning to be discovered during autopsy. But she got in that car and drove straight into a tree, creating the perfect cover story. Thaddeus blamed himself. The investigation focused on driver error, and no one looked too closely at the toxicology results. Except me. Vivian's expression darkened. Except you. Do you have any idea how long I've been planning this? How many years I've spent positioning myself to inherit everything when Thaddeus finally died of his broken heart? And then you showed up and started undoing all my careful work. Thaddeus stirred slightly on the couch, his breathing becoming more labored. Evangeline could see that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Whatever Dr. Cross had injected him with was designed to cause exactly this kind of cascade failure. The research was never about money for you, was it? Evangeline said, trying to keep Vivian distracted while she prepared a dose of cardiac stimulant. It was about Thaddeus himself. Of course it was about Thaddeus, Vivian snapped, her composure finally cracking. It was always about Thaddeus. Do you think I spent my entire life watching him from the sidelines because I cared about pharmaceutical patents? I've been in love with him since we were children, but he never saw me as anything more than the neighbor girl who tagged along with his precious sister. The jealousy in her voice was toxic, years of obsession twisted into something murderous. Isadora was always in the way, always taking his attention, always being the brilliant one, the special one. Even after I killed her, even after she was gone, she still had more of his heart than I ever did. So you decided to kill him too. I decided to set him free, Vivian corrected, raising the syringe. Free from guilt, free from pain, free to be with his beloved sister in whatever comes after. It's really quite romantic when you think about it. Evangeline could hear sirens in the distance. The ambulance Dr. Cross had called was finally approaching. But they were still minutes away, and Thaddeus didn't have minutes. You're insane, she said, pulling out her own syringe filled with emergency cardiac medication. I'm in love, Vivian replied, lunging toward the couch. What happened next was pure instinct. Evangeline blocked Vivian's approach, grabbing her wrist and forcing the syringe away from Thaddeus. They struggled, Vivian's desperation giving her strength that Evangeline hadn't expected. He'll never love you. Evangeline gasped as they fought. Even if you kill me, even if you kill him, he'll never love you the way you want. He would have, Vivian snarled, her fingernails raking across Evangeline's cheek. If you hadn't interfered, if you hadn't made him remember how to hope. The syringe flew across the room, shattering against the fireplace. Vivian screamed in rage and frustration, the sound of years of obsession and planning collapsing around her. The sirens were getting closer now, and Evangeline could see flashing lights through the study windows. Help was almost here, but Thaddeus was still unconscious, his breathing becoming more shallow by the second. It doesn't matter, Vivian said, backing away from the couch with wild eyes. He's too far gone. You can't save him. Nobody can save him. But Evangeline was already administering the cardiac stimulant, already beginning chest compressions, already fighting for the life of the man who'd become so much more than just a patient. As the paramedics burst through the mansion's front door, as Vivian was tackled and restrained by the police officers who followed, Evangeline felt Thaddeus's pulse strengthen slightly under her hands. He was still alive. Barely, but alive. And for the first time since leaving the mansion earlier that evening, she allowed herself to hope that love might be stronger than obsession, that truth might triumph over years of carefully constructed lies. The real fight was just beginning. 6 months later, Evangeline stood in the garden behind Blackwater Mansion, watching Thaddeus address the small gathering that had assembled for the dedication of the Isadora Blackwater Medical Research Foundation. The transformation in him was nothing short of miraculous. The pale, dying man she'd first encountered had been replaced by someone who radiated health and purpose. The cardiac surgery had been successful beyond anyone's expectations. Once Dr. Cross had been forced to reveal the true nature of the medications he'd been administering, Thaddeus's medical team discovered that his underlying condition was far less severe than originally diagnosed. The systematic poisoning had been masking a treatable arrhythmia that responded beautifully to proper medication and surgical intervention. My sister believed that medical research should serve humanity, not profit margins, Thaddeus was saying to the assembled doctors, researchers, and journalists. This foundation will ensure that her work continues, that her vision of accessible cardiac care becomes reality for patients who might otherwise have no hope. Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to him speak. The guilt and despair that had consumed him for 5 years were gone, replaced by a determination to honor Isadora's memory through action rather than self-destruction. The foundation would fund research into the very cardiac medications that had been used to kill her, turning her death into a catalyst for saving other lives. Vivian Harrington was serving a life sentence for first-degree murder, her carefully constructed facade having crumbled completely during the trial. Dr. Cross had received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, his testimony providing the final pieces of evidence needed to prove the conspiracy. The revelation that Thaddeus had been systematically poisoned for months had shocked the medical community and led to new protocols for monitoring patient medications. But for Evangeline, the most important transformation had nothing to do with justice or medical breakthroughs. It was the way Thaddeus looked at her now, the way his eyes lit up when she entered a room, the way his hands sought hers whenever they were together. The trust that had been shattered that terrible night 6 months ago had been rebuilt stronger than before. Thaddeus had sought her out the day after his surgery, still weak but determined to apologize for doubting her, for allowing Vivian's manipulation to come between them. "You saved my life in every way that matters," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just medically, but spiritually. You gave me back my sister's memory. You gave me back my future, and somehow you managed to give me back myself." Their relationship had developed slowly after that, built on a foundation of shared trauma and mutual respect that had gradually deepened into something neither of them had expected. Evangeline had never planned to fall in love with a patient, had never imagined that a job taken out of financial desperation would lead to the kind of connection she'd read about, but never believed existed. As the dedication ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Thaddeus made his way to where she stood beside the garden's fountain. He moved with the easy confidence of someone whose heart was finally beating strong and steady, whose future stretched ahead, filled with possibility. "How did I do?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist. "You were perfect," she said, meaning it completely. Isadora would be proud. "I hope so." His expression grew serious for a moment. "I spent so many years focused on guilt and death that I forgot how to think about legacy in life. You reminded me that the best way to honor someone's memory is to live fully." Evangeline leaned into his embrace, marveling at how right this felt, how completely they fit together. Speaking of living fully, she pulled back slightly to look at him, noting the way his green eyes sharpened with attention. There was something she'd been waiting to tell him, something that would change their future in the most wonderful way. "I have something to tell you," she said, unable to keep the smile from spreading across her face. Thaddeus went very still, and she could see him reading her expression, picking up on the joy and nervousness she was trying to contain. "Evangeline," he said softly, hope and wonder mixing in his voice. "I'm pregnant." The words came out in a rush, followed immediately by laughter as Thaddeus swept her off her feet, spinning her around the garden with a whoop of pure joy that scattered the remaining birds from the nearby trees. "Twins," she added when he finally set her down, breathless from laughter and the intensity of his kiss. "Twins." He stared at her in amazement, his hands coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Are you serious?" "2 heartbeats," she confirmed, placing her hands over his. Strong and steady, just like their father. The emotion that crossed Thaddeus's face was indescribable, joy and wonder and love all mixed together with something that looked like awe. This man who had spent years believing he deserved only death and guilt was being offered the chance to create new life, to start a family that would honor the past while embracing the future. "Marry me," he said suddenly, urgently. "I know we've talked about it. I know we were planning to wait, but I can't wait anymore. I want you to be my wife before these babies arrive. I want us to be a family in every possible way." Evangeline felt her heart swell with so much happiness she thought it might burst. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in the mansion's library, surrounded by the books where they'd first begun to trust each other, where they'd uncovered the truth that had set them both free. Evangeline wore a simple white dress that accommodated her growing belly, and Thaddeus wore a smile that outshone the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and protect each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, Evangeline thought about the strange journey that had brought them together. She'd come to this mansion expecting to care for a dying man, and instead she'd found someone who taught her that love could indeed conquer death, that truth was always worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the darkest circumstances. The twins were born healthy and strong on a spring morning 6 months later, a boy and a girl with their father's green eyes and their mother's determined spirit. Thaddeus wept when he held them for the first time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of love and hope they represented. "Thank you," He whispered to Evangeline as they sat together in the hospital room, each holding one of their children. For everything. For saving my life. For believing in the truth. For giving me a reason to live that's bigger than revenge or guilt. Thank you, she replied. For showing me that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Outside the hospital window, spring was in full bloom, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. The sound seemed to carry a message of hope and renewal, of love triumphant over loss, of life emerging stronger and more beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The Blackwater family had been reborn, and their future stretched ahead bright with promise.